afterwards. That sound good? All right, so we'll start with you, Ms. Miller.
So my name's Adian Miller. I'm an attorney at Morgan & Morgan. It's a large Florida-based firm. It's largely known for PI, but we actually have a labor and employment department. So I handle discrimination cases, harassment cases, the whole gamut.
My name is Meshia M. Bean. I'm a sexual assault and multiple sclerosis advocate living with multiple sclerosis, and I'm here to share my story about my experience of being harassed on my job several years ago.
All right, so thank you so much. So we'll get straight into it. So obviously, as I tell people, you know, if there is a job that needs to be done, then women get it done. So if you could start by telling us, apart from the obvious, why is it so important to have this discussion about sexual harassment from a professional standpoint and also from a personal standpoint? Why is it important that we get this message out about how to avoid doing things like that?
Start there and go back.
Well, for me, I remember just signing the piece of paper like Banjo said. I don't remember really taking in classes about it, but it's very important because I was scared to tell. I was harassed and I was afraid, and I just shut down, and I ended up quitting my job instead of filing charges.
I think that it's important because I think everyone should have the opportunity to work and earn a decent living without feeling scared, uncomfortable, and not really safe at work. And so I think having more discussions about it kind of sets or raises the bar for appropriate behavior in the workforce.
I think the important thing to consider is if we don't have this conversation, then women are always going to be a secondary class and a cheaper form of labor, and we're always going to be exploited. And, you know, women are more than the majority of people on this planet. So if there's no hope for women to be validated and contribute meaningfully, then there's no hope for any other sort of minority aspect either.
Great, thank you for those responses. So to tie it back to the mission statement of Minority Access to Capital, we focus on capital and capital access and things like that. So from an employer standpoint, I know you gave us some numbers about how much it costs in productivity and things like that, but from your law practice, speak to the business owners that we serve as a nonprofit, because a lot of times, you know, talking about the bottom line gets people's attention. You can talk about the touchy-feely stuff, but if you tell them how much it costs, or if they get in trouble, usually that'll shock them. Could you tell us more about maybe the numbers and the costs and the headache of going through court if you have an allegation against you like that? And then, Meshia, if you could talk to us about your journey of making sure that you took care of what you needed to take care of while quitting your job, because that's a scary thing.
So I'll leave you the numbers to you since I don't have that sort of thing. But I will say that as somebody who sues companies all the time, I love to look for smaller employers that are growing rapidly and have not really invested in HR. Those are my best targets. And unfortunately, that's where a lot of harassment and discrimination happens because they are sort of unmonitored workplaces. And I can say that even if these allegations prove, you know, to be meritless, the journey to prove it's expensive. You're going to be spending a couple days in depositions or at mediations. It's going to take time out of your life, and it's stressful. So if you can avoid all that just by being above board and decent, it seems like a really economical trade-off.
For me, I reported my situation to my boss, and he begged me not to say anything because he didn't want to lose his company. And he stated that he would make sure that my supervisor wouldn't be around me, but that didn't stop for him harassing me. So I put in my 2 weeks notice, but that didn't last long. I quit within a couple days, so.
I read an article on Facebook, and I clicked on it to verify there was an actual story. But I read that when it comes to like either rape or sexual assault, that when men say that that's happening to them, they have a harder time. People just don't believe it. So do you think? In your experience, have you seen many cases where there have been men that have been sexually assaulted? And do you think that this particular article was true in that, maybe those are some unreported numbers as well? I know we talked about some unreported numbers from women, but how pervasive is it, for the men out there who might be going through this?
What I would say is that what I was touching on earlier about toxic masculinity, I think a lot of times it promotes or rewards bad behavior by men, but it also prevents some men from feeling comfortable to speak up when they've been assaulted or sexually assaulted. But what I would say is the overwhelming majority of victims are going to be women. And it has more to do with power and control, okay? You are not going to try to sexually harass someone who has more power than you, okay? That's not going to happen, so let's just break it down. So you're not going to sexually harass or assault someone who has more power than you, okay? We know, statistically speaking, men tend to have more power because they hold more positions as CEO, they have more money, they're paid more, they're valued more, so they have the power. So now, because they have the power, now they're in a position to exert that power over someone else, okay? So it's about power and control. That's what domestic violence is about. That's what sexual assault's about. That's what sexual harassment is about. Whenever it comes out that, oh, so-and-so is a domestic violence, domestic abuser or a rapist, what does everyone say? I had no idea. He was the nicest person in the world. It's because he's not trying to sexually harass his female supervisor because he doesn't want to get fired, right? He has that much control to not do it in inappropriate situations and does it behind closed doors because he can get away with it, okay? And so I'm not trying to diminish the real reality that a lot of men are victims and they don't say anything for the same reasons why women do, but in an additional layer. But the vast majority are going to be women because of the power disparities between men and women.
I would agree with that. I mean, I've been doing this type of litigation for about 7 years, and I can't really say that I've had men come to me with potential cases, except for, I will say, I've had some gay men come to me. And I think that would also be true because you're talking, again, to those power dynamics. Mm-hmm. And it would be places like they work in a warehouse, someplace where they're isolated, and they would be assaulted by somebody. So I've had those instances. I cannot say that, heterosexual men have often come to me, and I don't know if that means it doesn't exist. I would be inclined to say it does. It just, again, it's not getting reported and they're not coming forward.
Now, for those of you that don't know, the type of law that I practice is, I push around a lot of paperwork and I talk on the phone a lot. So I don't have the pleasure of going to court and litigating. So this might be an embarrassing question coming from a lawyer. But explain to us where's the line between sexual harassment, which I'm assuming is purely civil, and then sexual assault? Which I'm assuming crosses over into the criminal realm. And then, Meshia, if you could, give us some more of your story about, when you knew at that point that it was sexual harassment. It wasn't, something playful when it really crossed that threshold. That'd be great.
So I find this point comes up a lot, that people don't realize when it's sexual assault. They think it's sexual harassment first. I can't even tell you the number of employees who've come to me and said that their male boss put their hand on them in some way, that they cupped their butt or something. And they'll say, well, it was like a one time, it was joking. And I'm like, well, that's actually assault. He put his hands on you in a sexual manner, it's sexual assault. And the employer, I've had this happen on at least 3 different occasions where the employer really was not that motivated to take action. And then I had them call and file a police report and have that person arrested for sexual assault because I don't play. And then all of a sudden the employer really cared about this case. And I think it's sort of like a light bulb goes off in people's heads. So, assault is when there's a touching or an imminent apprehension of touching that's unwanted. This is a technical legal form. Harassment can just be without any sort of physical component, but you can have these acts that are both.
Yes, I would agree. I would say a lot of situations will qualify as both harassment and sexual assault. Like you said, touching of certain genital areas or breasts, buttocks, that's going to end up being assault or sexual assault. But it really kind of depends on the particular situation. I think that I think the hardest part for people is the small jokes, the emails, just the culture, and it's kind of hard to quantify what the culture is, but what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. Everyone knows don't touch anyone's butt, right? Or don't touch anyone's breast or whatever. But do you have these other situations where people keep making comments? I would say there was this one investigator I used to be a colleague with, and every day he would say something about the way my clothes is fitting on me, and it's like, I'm not here parading for your pleasure. That is not what I'm doing. And once or twice, maybe once, let's just say once a week, I could probably deal with that. But when it's just I was like, I don't want to go by this person's office now, okay? And you have to think about it. When I was mentioning the productivity, is when someone else's behavior is like a drop in the water. If someone else's behavior is having a ripple effect. So now I'm wasting 2-3 minutes walking around another way to avoid this person who's going to be commenting on how my clothes fit, okay? And that's going to affect your bottom dollar. So it's like those situations that we're talking about.
But one story I can say that my supervisor was a police officer. So I remember standing at an elevator one time, and he came up behind me and pulled me towards him with one arm around my waist and another arm around my neck. And I felt his breath on my cheek, and he said, "Good morning." And I stunned, and I just pushed him away. I'm like, okay. I said, "Please don't do that again, I'm good." And he was just like, "I'm just saying good morning to you." And he was laughing. So I know another incident, I was at the computer, and there was 3 other officers in the room with me. And he came up behind me, and he grabbed me again, and this is like a couple of days later, and kissed me on my cheek. And at that moment, I remember I just stood up and I grabbed this empty plastic Coke bottle I had, and I hit him 3 times in his arm. And he just put his arms up and told me, "Oh, calm down, it's not that serious, I'm just greeting you." And I cussed him out, and I told the other officers, "Don't you see what's going on? You're not going to say anything?" And they didn't say nothing. They just looked. They were men officers. They didn't say anything. So that's when I filed my report. And like I said, my boss told me, please don't say anything because he don't want to lose his company. And that he told my supervisor to just stay away from me when I'm at work. And I remember seeing the reflection on the monitor, and my supervisor came in behind me, and he put the gun gesture to me. So that's when I just went ahead and I just quit my job. But I should have filed charges. So I hope he didn't do this to anybody else, and nobody else has came forward. So that's a little bit of my story.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that story. So back to, I know, Meshia, you specifically and directly told him that you didn't want those advances. But, legally speaking, is there something, I know you mentioned document, obviously I love a good piece of paper, but for women who are out there, if they don't say anything or if they tell somebody else, sort of from a legal standpoint, what needs to happen in order to make sure that if a suit goes forward or they're able to make a claim, that there is some type of way that says, hey, did you tell the person no, or did you document it, or is sexual harassment something that even if the victim doesn't say anything, because the act is still happening, it's still sexual harassment? I hope I'm asking the question where it makes sense. Is there anything that the woman necessarily has to do in order to bring it over that threshold?
Well, I'm a big fan in terms of documenting. We live in an email culture, so I'm a big fan of emails because they can be casual, passive aggressive, and document everything. So correctly done, it's a saver. But if it's, the general rule is if it's your supervisor, the employer is going to be responsible regardless of if you report it. And if it's not an employer, then you need to report it to management so that supervisor has a chance to respond. Generally speaking, and I think it's a good rule of practice, is you want to express that you're not interested once. And then I think after that, it is very clear. You've laid down the line. I'm not interested. If they continue to come back, then they're on notice. Not to say that you have to. I'm just saying generally I think it's a good idea. I personally, and I hate that we live in a world where we have to do this, but the way I introduce myself to people is I'm like, hi, I'm Adian. I'm a hyper feminist, and I'm really type A, and I don't like sexy jokes. And people are a little afraid of me, and I'll see them say something, and I'll be like, oh no, not around Adian. I'm like, that's right. And that's what I like. Like, I don't want to hear your tawdry. Like, we're not close like that. This is my job. So, and I kind of hate that I have to go that far out and like overcorrect. But yeah, I do think putting people on notice is helpful. At the end of the day, if you can document it in some way, it's always the best thing.
I would, like I said before, documenting is always the best for you. I would say from a victim centered point of view, I think that if we look at similar situations, whether we're talking about stalking or harassing phone calls, if someone is stalking you, you don't need to tell them, don't stalk me, before someone is responsible for their behavior. If someone is calling you 100 times, you don't need to tell them, don't call me, before they know and they're held liable for their own behavior. So I always get very concerned when we're shifting to what victims should do. I think everyone is responsible for their own behavior, and I think people just need to be mindful of that. Despite what we're saying here, I am a very jovial, fun person, but when I walk into the work, or the office, it's work, it's work. It's not my home, so when people are feeling too comfortable in their behavior, and that's the line. So I think that it's important that people know that you don't need to necessarily say no. It's an extra bonus, okay? And remember, it has to be severe and pervasive, or serious situations. Serious meaning like a grabbing of someone's breast, and severe and pervasive as in like you just keep doing it. And which kind of goes to a point that I wanted to make earlier about someone saying no. I think a lot of times people make the assumption that a lack of a no means yes, and only yes means yes. So with the same situation before, if you ask me out Monday through Sunday and I keep ducking and dodging, not answering your question, it doesn't mean now next Monday you ask again. If you lack the emotional intelligence to decipher what that means, you don't just guess and assume it's a yes. Right? That's really what it is. People need to know that only yes means yes. Oh, sorry. No, here you go.
All right, great. So we're going to open it up for questions after this last question. But what are, I guess, three things, if we could take away 3 things, because there's a lot of information, a lot of good information, but if there are 3 things that you could give to both employers and employees related to this subject, what would it be? Maybe we'll narrow it down to 1 thing, so that's easier. So 1 thing that you would give an employer, and 1 piece of advice you would give an employee about sexual misconduct. But before I ask this, I just came up with one of my personal questions. So it's my understanding that the definition of sexual harassment has to do with an employer-employee relationship. Is it the same? What do you call the relationship or something that's going on if it's an employer and an independent contractor, or an employer and a part-time employee? Does it play by the same set of rules? I know we had this issue down under the Gold Dome and wanted to, or between co-equals. Like what is the term for that?
I think it's vicarious liability, and it attaches when you report it, again, to somebody with management or with the ability to change it and take action. So I know that there have been cases where independent contractors have harassed somebody, and the employer or the company that was employing them was found liable because they knew about it and didn't take action. So I know that can happen. But as a lawyer, you know something else.
No. I honestly don't really have an answer to your question, but what I would like to say is that even if something is technically legal for you to do, you have to look at the greater picture. Again, sexual harassment is not productive at all. Doesn't help you get more money, doesn't help you get successful. So even if something you're not going to be held liable for, I think as far as setting the culture, it's important that you try to make sure everything is above board. And when everything is above board, you will match and exceed any standard applied to your organization. And I think there's also limits on how many employees you have to have. There's things that I don't do civil, I just do criminal. But yeah, there's a lot of limitations or requirements when it comes to being actually held liable for sexual harassment of an employee.
I would say though, from a small business perspective, even if you don't meet the size requirements to be held liable under the laws, the EEOC is still going to investigate you if your employee goes and files a charge. So, even if they find out that you're not, there's going to be a file on you, and you're going to have to answer questions, and it's a whole thing. So, yes.
So speaking of the EEOC, that's a good question. I'm going to get to the closing question soon, but you're bringing up good points. So the EEOC, so a lot of people think that you can just go straight to the courthouse, and I think I read somewhere that employment law is one of the most litigated, if not the most litigated area of law, right? So explain what the EEOC is and sort of how it works, and I'm sure there's a public policy behind why we have the EEOC and you can't go straight to the courthouse.
So, so you have to go to the EEOC first, and they have a 6-month period where you can't do anything, where they investigate it. In reality, it can sometimes take much longer. And you can't bring a suit unless it's age discrimination or an Equal Pay Act violation. So there are 2 exceptions to that rule, but for the most part, you have to go through this 6-month investigatory process with your EEOC office. I think the public policy piece of it, or the theory, how it was invented, was the idea that maybe you don't need a lawyer to actually be represented and be investigated. And so the nice thing about the EEOC is anyone can walk in off the street and make a charge against any employer and have an investigation done. So in theory, there's sort of this great mechanism. It levels the playing field. In reality, the EEOC is one of the most underfunded agencies, and they don't have the resources to deal with the amount of intakes that they get. And so these cases usually don't get I'm getting recorded, okay. They may not always be fully investigated, and they may not get all the attention that they deserve. And then the reality is 6 months is a long time to be in a place if you're being harassed. 6 months is enough to drive you into a hole. 6 months is enough to lose your house and your car. It can be devastating to people. And so it's tough. It's really tough. But after the 6 months, usually you get your right to sue letter, and then you can go forward with a lawsuit in the nearest federal district court. None of this applies if you're a federal employee. If you're a federal employee, you have like a 3-year administrative process, and it's crazy. So that's a whole other thing. Yeah, it's great. So you have to do an informal complaint and a formal complaint, and then you get to go to an administrative judge, and then from there you can appeal to the Office of Federal Operations, and then after you get that decision, which is usually about 4 years down the road, then you can often go and bring a lawsuit. So federal employees even have it tougher.
Wow. Well, I just learned something new there. Okay. All right. All right. So now for the closing question. So if you could give one takeaway for the employers who are mostly small business owners, and one for the employees or the potential victims, what would it be?
Unlike my situation, don't be afraid to say anything. Just speak up and tell your supervisor, HR. I worked for a small little company, so I didn't have HR to go to. Had to go straight to the boss that ran the little company that I was doing my camera surveillance at. So just say something, and don't judge a book by its cover. Just because the way the person looks, don't give you the right to think they're easy or something. So we got, well, you want us to be mean or be nice, you know, so, because I can be both, you know, but don't come at me wrong like that.
I would say addressing a mound is better than addressing a mountain. I think for employers, it's important to, you can curb behavior by just noticing the small things and addressing it. Like, hey, that's not cool. And you could still have a really great employee that just may not know what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, okay? And when it comes to the folks on the receiving end, again, unfortunately, not everyone is as a jokester like myself or works in a place where, I feel comfortable to directly say something to someone. But if you feel uncomfortable with a small situation and it happens a few times, you may need to just tell someone or figure something out or document it. It really just kind of depends. It's easy for, someone to just say, you should report it, you have to report it, but everyone's situation is so different. A work colleague of my, one of my best friends, she's a prosecutor in Metro Atlanta area, and her investigator pushed her up against the wall by her neck. And another person saw this in the office. Fast forward 2 months, she just won her trial, and the next day she was in a major case unit handling like sexual assault cases against children, crimes against children. The next week, she was demoted to prelims, doing things that law students do, okay? And she ended up just quitting. She had the ability to do so. She had a husband who didn't require her salary, but most women, most people don't have that luxury. So I would say that everyone has to make the decision for themselves as to what the appropriate course is. What's key is to making sure you know the resources and you can build out your village. Because the more secure you are, the better or more likely you are to speak up about what's going on.
I think for employers, I would say take everything seriously, take the issue seriously, no matter what. If you take the issue seriously, you're never going to have to look at the person being accused of something and try to make a value judgment on the spot as to whether or not they did it. It's just going to matter. The issue's going to matter. And you're not going to be looking at, like what you talked about, those high value earners. No one is above this. So when the issue is of paramount importance, then it almost makes it easier. For women, I would say that we've seen a lot about the Time's Up movement, and what I think is genuinely exciting about it is they actually do have a legal fund now, and they will pay legal costs for people who bring sexual discrimination lawsuits. And I'm one of the attorneys, I get some cases through them. So it's a real thing, it operates, it's through the National Women's Law Center. Getting a free attorney is an amazing resource. And I think maybe men just knowing that, people who are harassing you and discriminating, because it could be women too. Just knowing that, you know, you might have more resources available, might make them a little more cautious. So